Welcome back to Piercing the Corporate Veil, Lessons from the Docket. I'm Professor Seth C. Orenberg, and in Episode 4, we delved into reverse veil piercing. In Episode 5, today, we continue with advanced variations of veil piercing by examining horizontal veil piercing, a doctrine that disregards the separateness between sibling entities under common ownership, allowing creditors to reach across related companies. This is crucial for understanding modern corporate groups, where structures can shield assets unfairly. We'll connect back to Episode 2's core tests and look forward to Episode 6's parent-subsidiary dynamics in regulatory environments. Horizontal veil piercing applies when courts treat affiliated entities as one for liability purposes. This is piercing sideways rather than up to owners or down to subsidiaries. It targets abuses where businesses fragment operations into multiple entities to isolate risks while operating as a unified whole. Courts use familiar factors. Again, we go back to the unity of interest test and the injustice test. But now we apply them laterally, often with greater caution, to avoid disrupting legitimate multi-entity planning. Horizontal piercing only really arises when there's some kind of asset shielding scheme, like real estate firms using separate LLCs to keep their property fenced off, but again, doing so in ways that violate some other rules. If the evidence shows undercapitalization or unified control without true independence, courts could pierce between the two to prevent injustice. For example, in California ex rel Van de Kamp versus Texaco, a court pierced horizontally when affiliates were manipulated to evade environmental cleanup costs. And we'll take a closer look at that in Episode 6. Jurisdictions vary. Delaware demands strong proof of abuse, while others, like California, are more plaintiff-friendly, especially in public policy cases. But the threshold is always high to preserve business flexibility and prevent patterns of evasion. Again, we are looking for evidence like commingling funds, shared officers, or asset shuffling that tip the scales, plus we need that element of injustice. For practitioners, this doctrine demands rigorous separateness. You should have distinct bank accounts for each separate entity. You should have independent decision-making and different boards, and each of the entities need to be adequately capitalized. Multi-entity structures offer tax and risk benefits, but without discipline, they invite piercing, especially for involuntary creditors like tort victims. As we conclude, horizontal veil piercing polices corporate families. Ensuring separateness isn't a facade for inequity. It builds on reverse piercing skepticism and emphasizes substance over form. It's used to protect against abuse, but it shouldn't be used to stifle innovation. In our next episode, we'll explore parent-subsidiary relationships, especially in regulatory and environmental context. But until then, let's talk about a few key takeaways. Horizontal veil piercing disregards separateness between sibling entities, meaning two entities that have the same parent. It requires the same tests we've seen before, like unity of interest and injustice. It basically applies Episode 2's factors when deciding whether or not to pierce laterally. Courts are cautious, especially in Delaware, because we could disrupt legitimate structures if we pierce too freely. Risks tend to rise if there's undercapitalization among affiliates, and particularly where we see fraud, like evasion schemes, although fraud's not a strict necessity of piercing. And all this foreshadows vertical regulatory applications, which we'll talk about next. But until then, I'm Professor Seth C. Orenberg, and I look forward to seeing you next time.